Imagine a town where black families thrived, where children played in the streets, where businesses excelled, and where people dreamed of a future free from oppression. Now, imagine that same town wiped off the face of the earth, erased with nothing left behind as if it never existed. Not by time, not by natural disaster, but by hate. This is not a story of war. It's not a tale of conquest or foreign invasion. This is the story of Rosewood, Florida, a small, independent black town that was destroyed in one of the most brutal racial massacres in American history. The year was 1923. Racial tensions across the United States were very extreme. The horrors of slavery had officially ended, but white supremacy was still deeply ingrained in the South. The Ku Klux Klan had resurged in power, and Jim Crow laws ensured that black Americans remained second-class citizens. And amid the racial terror, one false accusation was all it took to seal the fate and existence of Rosewood. A white woman in the neighboring town of Sumner screamed for help, claiming she had been attacked by a black man. Within hours, an armed mob who were thirsty for blood was formed. Their destination was Rosewood. What followed was a nightmarish rampage that lasted for days. Homes were burned to the ground, men were lynched. Women and children fled into the swamps, their cries swallowed by the dense Florida wilderness. And when the dust settled, Rosewood was gone. What makes this story even more terrifying is that it was almost completely erased from history. The media buried the truth. Survivors were too afraid to voice out, and for decades America pretended Rosewood never existed. However, history always has a way of resurfacing. In this video, we are going to expose the truth. We will take you through the rise and fall of Rosewood, the lies that led to its destruction, the horrors its residents faced, and the battles that lasted decades to bring justice to those who lost everything. If we don't tell these stories, they will be erased again. This is the tragic story of the Rosewood Massacre and how a Florida town was erased from history. Before Rosewood became a ghost town, before its streets were stained with blood and its buildings reduced to ashes. It was a thriving, independent black community. A town where hard work translates to prosperity, where families built homes, and where black men and women dared to dream in the face of a world that tried to keep them down. Florida, Rosewood wasn't always a black town nestled in the heart of Levy County. In the mid-1800s, it was a mixed community, home to both black and white families. The town was named after the rose-colored wood that came from its pine trees, a resource that made it a prime location for the timber industry. Like many southern towns, Rosewood's economy thrived on logging and the production of railroad ties. Timber mills provided steady work, and the town's location near the Gulf of Mexico allowed for easy transportation of goods. But while white families found wealth in large industries, black residents of Rosewood pursued something even more valuable: independence. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, Rosewood had transformed into a predominantly black town. Many of its black residents were formerly enslaved people or descendants of those who had escaped bondage. They built homes, businesses, and schools. They were extremely determined to carve out a future where they could control their destiny. Rosewood was a town of success, not a place of poverty and struggle. Black families owned their land, they ran their businesses, there were churches, general stores, schools, and even a Masonic lodge. The people of Rosewood were educated, skilled, and above all, self-dependent. And that self-dependence made them a target. In the Jim Crow South, a prosperous black town was seen as a threat. It defied the racist narrative that black people were inferior and that they needed white oversight to survive. And in a world where white supremacy was the law of the land, Rosewood's success seemed dangerous. In the early 20th century, the racial climate in Florida had turned volatile. The Ku Klux Klan was becoming more powerful, and racial violence was not only common, it was often encouraged. Lynchings were used to keep black communities in fear, and any sign of black advancement was met with extreme brutal retaliation. In nearby towns like Sumner, white workers resented the growing independence of black citizens. Many worked at the same sawmills and industries as Rosewood's black population, but they couldn't stand the idea that a black family could own land while they still rented. that a black businessman could be successful while they lived paycheck to paycheck. Yet despite the growing racial tensions, Rosewood's residents remained hopeful. They continued to build, to educate their children, to build their businesses. But what they didn't know was that their very existence was hanging by a thread. On January 1st, 1923, that thread snapped off. A white woman in Sumner screamed. And just like that, Rosewood's fate was sealed. January 1st, 1923, New Year's Day. For most, it was the beginning of a new chapter. But for the residents of Rosewood, it was the day their entire world began to crumble. In the early morning hours, an insane scream rang out from the home of Fannie Taylor, a young white housewife living in Sumner, a neighboring town just a few miles from Rosewood. Moments later, Fannie stumbled out of her house, her face bruised and her clothes torn. She was in distress, and she was making a grave accusation. She claimed she had been attacked by a black man. The news rapidly spread like wildfire through Sumner. Her husband, James Taylor, who was a foreman at a local mill, was quick to act. He gathered a group of white men, neighbors, co-workers, and anyone who would listen. They took up their guns, fueled by rage and the deeply ingrained belief that black men were a constant threat to white women. They were determined to hunt down the so-called criminal. But there was one problem. Fannie's story wasn't adding up. Some of the people in Sumner began to whisper doubts. There were no witnesses to the attack. No one saw a black man enter or leave the house. And the way Fannie described her injuries didn't make any slight sense. Rumors quickly surfaced that Fannie's injuries weren't the result of an assault by a black man at all. Some claimed she had been attacked by a fellow white lover, a man she wasn't supposed to be involved with, a man who had beaten her in a fit of rage before fleeing. But in the Jim Crow South, truth had little power against racial hatred, and for a white woman to admit she had been attacked by a white man would have meant scandal, shame, maybe even worse. So instead, she let the lie fester, and that lie became deadly. James Taylor wasn't looking for justice. He was looking for blood. He was convinced, or at least claimed to be, that a black man from Rosewood was responsible, and he wasn't alone. The Ku Klux Klan had been growing stronger in Florida, and racial violence was at an all-time high. Just 3 years earlier, in 1920, a massacre in Ocoee had wiped out a thriving black community over black men daring to vote. In this environment, all it took was a single false accusation to justify terror. Within hours, white men from Sumner and neighboring towns formed a mob. They rode into Rosewood, guns loaded, anger burning in their eyes. They knocked on doors and barged into homes, demanding answers. But the people of Rosewood were ignorant. They had no idea who had attacked Fannie Taylor because none of them had. But the mob wasn't interested in the truth. They were looking for a scapegoat, and they found one in Sam Carter, who was a well-respected black blacksmith. Sam Carter's fate was sealed, dragged from his home, beaten and accused without evidence. They lynched him under the cover of darkness. His body left as a warning to the rest of Rosewood. Even after Sam Carter was murdered, the mob wasn't satisfied. They needed more victims. They convinced themselves that others in Rosewood were hiding the so-called attacker. The rage wasn't about justice anymore. It was about destruction. It was about power. It was about reminding the black residents of Rosewood that no matter how successful they were, they could never be safe. Local authorities, who were supposed to protect the innocent, did nothing. They stood by, watching as Rosewood's residents became prisoners in their town. Some officers even fed into the hysteria, warning black families to stay put instead of fleeing while they had the chance. Behind closed doors, many in Sumner knew the truth. They knew Fannie Taylor had lied. They knew the real attacker had likely been a white man. But admitting that now was impossible. They had already spilled blood. They had already tasted vengeance, and they weren't willing to stop. The mob wasn't done. They had only just begun. Over the next few days, their hatred consumed everything in its way. Homes were burnt, innocent lives were lost, and an entire town was wiped off the map. And the worst part was, no one was coming to save them. The word had spread quickly. A growing mob of white men, now in the hundreds, was preparing to march toward Rosewood. Many had traveled from neighboring towns to answer the call for justice. But this wasn't justice. It was vengeance. And they were carrying guns, torches, and the full weight of generations of racial hatred. January 4th, 1923. The mob was formed. They didn't come to ask questions. They didn't come to search for the truth. They came with a demand: hand over the so-called attacker of Fannie Taylor. The people of Rosewood had no answers to give. They hadn't seen a black man fleeing Sumner, they hadn't heard of any crime, but the mob didn't care. When no one turned over a suspect, the mob made their decision. If Rosewood wouldn't give them a man, they would take everything else. First bloodshed. Unfortunately, Sam Carter was one of the first to cross paths with the mob. He had done nothing wrong. His only crime was being at the wrong place at the wrong time. They claimed he had helped a fugitive escape. There was no evidence, no trial, no chance for Carter to defend himself. Their minds were made up already. They lynched him, shot him, beat him, and left his body as a message to the rest of Rosewood. This was only the beginning. As night fell, the mob's rage became hotter. They stormed into Rosewood, setting fire to black-owned homes, stores, and churches. Flames swallowed the town, turning night into day with an eerie, hellish glow. Families ran for their lives, escaping into the thick Florida swamps. Parents carried their children, stumbling through the mud, hiding beneath the dense foliage, hoping the darkness would shield them. The angry mobs didn't just burn homes, they hunted people. Armed men searched the swamps, tracking footprints and firing their guns into the darkness at anything that moved. Black men, women, and children were not spared from their wrath. And the mob wasn't reducing, it was growing rapidly. White men from nearby counties arrived eagerly to join in the bloodshed. They weren't here for justice. They were here to kill, to destroy, to erase Rosewood from existence. With each passing hour, the violence became more brutal, and the death toll increased. A black woman, Sarah Carrier, was shot inside her home as she tried to shield her grandchildren from the gunfire. Her son, Sylvester Carrier, tried to fight back, firing a rifle at the attackers, but he was outnumbered, outgunned. They shot him dead. The mob showed no mercy. They dragged people from their hiding places, beating them, shooting them. Black bodies fell, left to rot where they lay. Even children weren't spared. Stories from survivors spoke of young boys and girls shot in cold blood. Their only crime was the color of their skin. For days, the terror continued. The people of Rosewood had nowhere to turn. Law enforcement, who were meant to uphold order, stood by and did nothing. Some even joined the fight. Help wasn't coming. The government didn't intervene. To the world outside, Rosewood didn't matter. But to the people living through this nightmare, they were experiencing their entire world being torn apart. As the massacre continued, some tried to escape. A few sympathetic white residents like John and William Bryce used their train to help black women and children flee. They risked their lives, knowing the mob wouldn't hesitate to turn on them. For those who made it onto the train, there was a chance at survival. But for those left behind, there was no salvation. By the time the fires burned out, Rosewood was unrecognizable. Homes were nothing but charred remains. Businesses were gone. Lives were lost. And an entire black town had been wiped off the map. But even as the dust settled, the horror of what happened in Rosewood was far from over. The survivors couldn't speak of it. Fear gripped them and silenced their voices for decades. And those who were responsible walked freely, unpunished. Their crimes were buried under a veil of white silence. The massacre had ended, but the cover-up was just beginning. January 6, 1923. The town of Rosewood was already drowning in terror, but what happened on this day erased it from history. By sunset, there would be no Rosewood left. The white mob, now numbering in the hundreds, was out for blood. They had murdered men in cold blood. They had terrorized families and ransacked homes. But it still wasn't enough. They wanted the destruction of the community. They began setting fire to every building that stood. The homes black families had worked so hard to build were gone in a matter of minutes. Churches that had once been filled with joyful voices were crumbled to smoldering ruins. Schools where black children had dreamed of a better future had now turned to ash. Dense smoke filled the air, making it impossible to breathe. The heat was unbearable, and for the people of Rosewood, there was nowhere left to run or hide. Women and children had no choice but to flee into the wilderness. At midnight, they stumbled through the swamps, barefoot, bleeding, with nothing but the clothes they had on. The sound of gunshots rang behind them. Every step could be their last. Mothers clutched their babies tightly, praying they wouldn't cry, praying they wouldn't be heard. But the mob was relentless. They hunted them down like animals. And those who were caught, they were shown no mercy. Survivors later told stories of unimaginable horror. Black men were dragged from their hiding places and shot on sight. Others were lynched, their bodies left hanging as warnings to anyone who dared to resist. The mob was celebrating. They posed for pictures next to the bodies of their victims. They cheered as homes collapsed into flames. This wasn't just about punishing one man. This was about erasing an entire black town from existence. For the children of Rosewood, the nightmare never ended. Many were too young to understand why they were running, why their fathers weren't coming back, and why the town they had called home no longer existed. But while all this horror went on, there was one place that had a glimpse of hope: John Richt's home. John Wright was a white store owner, one of the few in Rosewood who saw the massacre for what it was: pure evil. Unlike his neighbors, he didn't turn his back. Instead, he risked everything to save those he could. One by one, desperate families arrived at his doorstep. He let them in. He hid them. He gave them food and water. He knew that if the mob found out, they would kill him too. But still, he didn't stop. And then John Wright did something even more extreme. He helped them escape. This spread to a sympathetic train conductor in nearby Gainesville. Late at night, he slowed his train just enough for the survivors to climb aboard. Women, children, and the elderly packed together, desperate to get away. They left everything behind. But at least they had their lives. They didn't know where they were going. Some ended up in Gainesville, others in towns further away. Many never saw each other again. Rosewood had been their home. Now they were refugees in their own country. And what did the government do? Nothing. No one in power tried to stop the slaughter. No one in law enforcement arrested the killers. No one even acknowledged what had happened to even render an apology. The local sheriff knew exactly who was responsible for the murders. He knew the names of the men who had led the mob. But in Jim Crow, Florida, white men didn't get punished for killing black people. Newspapers barely wrote about the massacre. Some even justified it by calling it a race riot, as if both sides had been equally at fault. The truth was buried, just like the victims. For decades, the survivors of Rosewood lived in silence. They were too afraid to tell their stories. The fear of the same thing happening again. And for many, that fear never faded. When the fires died down, there was nothing left. The land where Rosewood once thrived was abandoned, swallowed by time. No one rebuilt. No one returned. Today, the only thing that remains of Rosewood is a small road sign, a reminder of what was lost. But the story of Rosewood isn't just history. It's a warning. Because Rosewood was not the first black town to be destroyed. And tragically, it wouldn't be the last. The town of Rosewood was gone, burned to the ground. Its people scattered, many fleeing with only one cloth. Families who had once thrived were now homeless, being forced into an exile they never expected. But what followed the massacre was perhaps even more chilling: silence. In the days and weeks after the massacre, the nation should have been outraged. The state of Florida should have pursued justice. Law enforcement should have hunted down those responsible. But none of that happened. Instead, the story of Rosewood was buried, erased, as if it had never happened at all. The newspapers that did report on the events twisted the truth. Some claimed that the black residents of Rosewood had been the aggressors and that the white mob had only acted in self-defense. Others barely mentioned it at all, burying the story in small, forgettable columns, as if the destruction of an entire town was nothing more than an unfortunate misunderstanding. There were a few who knew the truth: some white citizens of Sumner, some law enforcement officers, and of course, the survivors of Rosewood. But fear gripped them all. Those who had witnessed the horror firsthand understood that speaking out could mean death. The mob had been ruthless, and those who participated in the massacre were still walking freely, unpunished, unrepentant, and with no remorse. Who would dare challenge them? The survivors of Rosewood lived with that fear for decades. They never spoke of what had happened, not even to their children. They carried the trauma with them, hidden beneath layers of silence. Although some told their children the stories under strict measures, not to say it outside, but to pass it down to other generations. To say the wrong thing to the wrong person could bring back the violence. To even acknowledge Rosewood's existence was dangerous. And so, Rosewood became a whisper, a ghost town in the truest sense. a tragedy left unspoken because speaking of it could cost lives. But fear wasn't the only reason Rosewood faded from memory. There were other forces at work, forces determined to wipe its very existence from history. By the 1940s, Rosewood had disappeared from official maps. The place where the town once stood was swallowed by overgrown trees and empty land. No markers, no signs, no acknowledgement that a thriving black community had once called it home. The land that once belonged to black families was taken, absorbed into the properties of white landowners. The survivors were too afraid or too powerless to fight back. They were left with nothing, no compensation, no restitution, just the knowledge that the place they had built with their own hands had been stolen and that they would never return. However, justice never came. No law enforcement officer was ever held accountable for standing by and allowing the mob to carry out its terror. No court ever heard the voices of the survivors, the legal system. For decades, the people who had once called Rosewood home kept their pain locked away. Some never spoke of it again, others tried to forget. But history cannot be erased so easily. And though the world tried to forget Rosewood, its survivors carried the truth in their hearts. Rosewood was more than a town. It was a symbol, a dream of black prosperity that was wiped out by the forces of racism and hatred. A place where families built their futures, only to have them stolen in a matter of days. But silence can only last for so long. And as time passed, whispers of Rosewood began to resurface. The truth, buried for decades, was waiting to be told. For decades, the town of Rosewood existed only in the memories of those who had survived its destruction. The ashes had settled, the land had grown over, but the wounds remained. For those who had escaped the horrors of January 1923, survival came at a cost. They had lost their homes, their businesses, and the very community that had once protected them. But worse than that, they had lost their voices. They knew that speaking out could mean more violence and more suffering. And so they kept their pain buried deep within. Some children grew up only hearing whispers about what had happened. Some never knew at all. The survivors had been taught one painful lesson. America was not ready to hear their truth. Officially, Rosewood was erased, not just from the map, but from history itself. The newspapers of the time either distorted the truth or ignored it entirely. And with no accountability, no justice, and no records to challenge the lies, the tragedy of Rosewood was reduced to nothing more than a forgotten ghost town. Then, in 1982, the silence was broken. A journalist from St. Petersburg Times, Gary Moore, stumbled upon whispers of a massacre in rural Florida, one that had never been fully documented. He was intrigued. He began digging, searching for the truth. What he found was shocking. Survivors, now in their 70s and 80s, they reluctantly shared their stories, many for the first time. They spoke of the horrors they had witnessed, the burning homes, the lynchings, the nights spent hiding in the swamps. They named names. They described the terror of running from their countrymen, knowing they had nowhere to turn. Their voices that has long been suppressed had finally found an audience. The world was beginning to listen. As Moore's reporting gained attention, the survivors of Rosewood saw an opportunity, one they never thought possible. They would demand justice. But in a country that had ignored them for so long, but could they truly win? In the early 1990s, the remaining survivors and their descendants took their fight to the Florida legislature. They wanted acknowledgement. They wanted accountability. And most importantly, they wanted reparations. For years, they fought an uphill battle. They faced skepticism, resistance, and even threats. But they had one thing on their side: undeniable proof. The truth was out. And in 1994, after extensive hearings and emotional testimonies, Florida made history. Florida became the first U.S. state to compensate victims of racial violence. The Rosewood Compensation Bill was passed, awarding $2.1 million to the survivors and their families. For those who had lived through the horror, no amount of money could erase the pain. However, this was more than compensation. It was recognition. It was proof that the massacre had happened, that their suffering had not been in vain. For the first time in American history, a state had officially admitted its role in racial violence and taken action to make amends. This acknowledgement came with something even more powerful: awareness. The story of Rosewood that was once buried was now being told. Books were written, documentaries were produced, and in 1997, Hollywood brought the tragedy to the big screen with the film Rosewood, directed by John Singleton. For many, this was their first time hearing about Rosewood. While the film was dramatized, it reignited discussions about America's violent racial history. It forced audiences to confront the reality of what had been done to an entire community and how easily that history had been erased. More importantly, it ensured that Rosewood would never be forgotten again. The town that was once wiped off the map was now recognized as a historic site. Markers were placed, memorials were built, and the descendants of Rosewood's residents could finally walk the land and see their ancestors honored. The story of Rosewood is not just a story of loss. It is a story of survival, a story of resilience, a story of truth finally rising after decades of being buried beneath lies and silence. Though the town itself is gone, its legacy continues to live in those who refuse to let its history fade. The survivors, the journalists, the activists, the families, all of them played a role in making sure Rosewood's name was remembered. It took more than 70 years, but the truth prevailed at last. And as long as we remember Rosewood, as long as we speak its name, we ensure that history will never again be erased. When the ashes of Rosewood settled, when the smoke had cleared, what was left behind wasn't just the rubble of a town, but the deep scar of a lost history. A history that many tried to erase, but a history that refuses to be forgotten. Today, we know the story of Rosewood, but for decades, it was a story silenced by fear, shame, and the systematic erasure of Black voices. The massacre at Rosewood was part of a larger framework, one of violent racial repression that echoed throughout the South and beyond. It connects to tragedies like the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, where a thriving Black community was also destroyed by a white mob. And it links back further, even to the Colfax Massacre of 1873, where the systematic violence against Black people wasn't just about terror, it was about erasing Black power and influence. These massacres were not random acts of violence, they were deeply connected. They were fueled by a fear of Black success, a fear that Black people might be able to build lives of dignity and autonomy in a world that desperately wanted to keep them oppressed. The destruction of Black prosperity was a violent act of control, whether it was in Tulsa, in Colfax, or in Rosewood, an attempt to strip Black people of their power and their place in American society. In Rosewood, it was the prosperity of the Black community that made them a target. The same can be said for the Greenwood district in Tulsa, known as Black Wall Street, which was thriving until it was razed to the ground in just 24 hours by an enraged white mob. The people of Colfax, Louisiana, suffered a similar fate in 1873 when armed white supremacists targeted Black citizens who had gained political power and were successfully leading the town's government. But while these massacres are often linked through history, it's not just the violence that connects them, it's the erasure. For decades, the massacre wasn't taught in schools. There was no public memorial, no recognition of the lives lost. It was as if the world decided that Rosewood didn't matter. The systematic racism that allowed Rosewood to be erased is still present today in the way history is taught and also the way history is remembered. Time and again, Black experiences, especially those of suffering and resistance, are left out of the public narratives. We see it in the continued omission of Black history from textbooks. We see it in the minimization of Black accomplishments and tragedies. And we see it in the silence that surrounds acts of racial violence. The erasure of history doesn't stop at the removal of monuments or the lack of representation. It continues when stories are forgotten, when the trauma isn't acknowledged, when the survivors' voices are silenced. The massacre at Rosewood is one of many examples of a violent attempt to bury a truth too uncomfortable for those in power to face. And yet, the fight for recognition has not ended. The survivors of Rosewood and their descendants have continued to demand justice. In 1994, Florida Governor Lawton Chiles issued a formal apology for the state's role in the massacre, and in 1994, a state commission was established to investigate the massacre. While it wasn't enough to undo the damage, it was a start. More recently, the demand for reparations for the descendants of those harmed by racial violence has gained more attention. Reparations are not just about money. They are about justice. They are about acknowledging that the wealth created by Black communities like Rosewood wasn't simply stolen. It was destroyed by hatred and racial violence. Reparation is also about telling the truth of America's history, about giving voice to those who have been silenced for too long. And they are about correcting a legacy of inequity that has been perpetuated for generations. The need to reckon with the past is not just about the past. It is about the future. It's about ensuring that the wounds of Rosewood, Tulsa, Colfax, and countless other forgotten massacres are never repeated. When we fail to acknowledge this history, we perpetuate the same cycles of hatred, division, and destruction that have plagued this country for centuries. Let us remember Rosewood, not just in sorrow, but in solidarity. And let that remembrance fuel the fight for justice, for reparations, and for a future where no one ever has to experience the horror of erasure again. If you want to join the movement of unraveling the truth of the Black history that has long been hidden from us, click the notification bell and like this video. Share this video, let's spread the truth together.